In this lecture, we are going to be covering two separate topics. First, we will be looking at the reading Letters from an American Farmer by J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur, and then the second half, we're going to do a short introduction to the Supreme Court. Because, if you haven't figured it out yet, Supreme Court cases are going to be our baseline or our guideline for this course. But let's go ahead and start with Letters from an American Farmer. I would suggest already having read this before listening to this lecture. So what happened is Crevecoeur was actually born in 1735 in Normandy, France. He traveled to England when he was 19, and then in 1755 he traveled to Canada and enlisted in the Canadian militia in 1759. He then traveled to New York and changed his name to Hector St. John. He traveled the colonies for 10 years as a surveyor and a trader with the American Indians, and in 1769 he bought land in Orange County, New York, and he actually farmed at his farm he called Pine Hill. He married and had children. However, during the American Revolution, he had Tory sympathies, meaning he sided more with England. And so he decided he was going to actually leave the Americas and go back to England. Interesting enough, though, as he tried to leave, the English captured him, thought he actually was an American spy, and so he was held for 3 months as a prisoner. Finally, he was released, and he moved to London and then France, leaving his wife and children behind. He returned to New York in 1783 as a French consul to New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut, only to find that his wife had died, his farm was destroyed, and his children were living with neighbors. Well, Letters from an American Farmer were a series of letters that he began to write in 1769 when he first began to farm at Pine Hill. They were first published in 1782 in London, and they were very successful there. Later editions were actually produced in different languages, including French. They were the first literary success by an American author in Europe, and they turned Crevecoeur into a celebrity figure. He was the first writer to describe to Europeans life in America and the new American dream. His work provided useful information for understanding the New World, and it helped to create an American identity in the minds of Europeans. Its publication followed close enough on the American Revolution to satisfy at this time there was almost this insatiable demand for all things American, and it confirmed for most readers a vision of a new land, rich and promising, where enterprise prevailed over class and fashion. And what we're going to look at, we are actually going to look at just two separate letters, letter 3 and letter 9. And what I want you to pay attention to is how or if his idea of America and Americans changed. So let's first look at letter number 3. Welcome to my shores, distressed European. Bless the hour in which thou didst see my verdant fields, my fair navigable rivers, and my green mountains. If thou wilt work, I have bread for thee. If thou wilt be honest, sober, and industrious, I have greater rewards to confer on thee, ease and independence. I will give thee fields to feed and clothe thee, a comfortable fireside to sit by, and tell thy children by what means thou hast prospered, and a decent bed to repose on. I shall endow thee, besides, with the immunities of a free man. If thou wilt carefully educate thy children, teach them gratitude to God and reverence to that government, that philanthropic government, which has collected here so many men and made them happy. I will also provide for thy progeny. Go thou and work until thou shalt prosper, provided thou be just, grateful, and industrious. And this is how, imagine if you're a poor landless European and you hear this description, what are you probably thinking? You're probably thinking, sign me up. I want to go to America. So let's look at letter 3. We're going to do a close reading. And let's first see how he actually describes America. Look on page 310. And here he talks about this, right? That we are a people of cultivators scattered over an immense territory, communicating with each other by means of good roads and navigable rivers, united by the silken bands of mild government, all respecting the laws without dreading their power because they are equitable, meaning they are equal. We are all animated with the spirit of an industry which is unfettering and unrestrained because each person works for himself. If he travels through our rural districts, he views not the hostile castle and the haughty mansion constructed by the clay-built hut and miserable cabin, where cattle and men have to keep each other warm, and dwell in meanness, smoke, and indigence. A pleasing uniformity of decent competence appears throughout our habitations. The meanest of our log houses is dry and comfortable habitation. Lawyer or merchant are the fairest titles our towns afford. That of a farmer is the only appellation of the rural inhabitants of our country. It must take some time ere he can reconcile himself to our dictionary, which is but short in words of dignity and names of honor. There on Sunday he sees a congregation of respectable farmers and their wives, all clad in neat homespun, well mounted or riding in their own humble wagons. There is not among them an esquire saving the unlettered magistrate. There he sees a parson as simple as his flock, a farmer who does not riot on the labor of others. We have no princes for whom we toil, starve, and bleed. We are the most perfect society now existing in the world. Here, man is as free as he ought to be. So again, you're the poor, landless European. This sounds great, that everybody is humble, everybody works, that there is no class system, that even the parson, who is the head of the church in the area, is humble. He starts by also giving praise to Englishmen, the Englishmen that have first come and started everything. So if you look at 3:10, he talks about they brought along with them their national genius. Here he sees the industry of his native country displayed in a new manner and traces in their works the embryos of all the arts, sciences, ingenuity which flourished in Europe. So he's giving Europeans credit for coming over and starting this. However, he very quickly changes this, right? And if you continue reading on 3:10, you again see another wonderful description of the United States, of the Americas. The rich and the poor are not so far removed from each other as they are in Europe. And he continues on. Make sure you do read this paragraph. And he ends, again, with we are the most perfect society now existing in the world. Here man is as free as he ought to be. And then he continues this, and he's talking to the poor Europeans on 3:11. He says what to them? He says to them, you can come here and what? You can be free. Here you have a chance to be a man. That in Europe, you don't own property. You don't have freedom. But in the United States, you have that opportunity that they should come here because Europe doesn't even really look at them as citizens. And he says, a country that has no bread for him, whose fields produced him no harvest, who met with nothing but the frowns of the rich, the severity of the laws, with jails and punishment. And he says, no, here you can come. You can come here and have everything. Everything has been tended to regulate them. New laws, a new mode of living, a new social system. Here they become men. So you can come here and you can thrive. But now by the power of transplantation, like all other plants, they have taken root and flourished. So it's almost like he's selling again that in America, you can come here, you will be seen as American as long as you work hard, and then you will be accepted. And then look on page 312. He asks then, what then is the American, this new man? He is either a European or the descendant of a European, hence that strange mixture of blood which you will find in no other country. And he goes on and on. He is an American who, leaving behind him all ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds. He becomes an American by receiving in the broad lap of our great alma mater. Here, individuals of all nations are melted into a new race of men, whose labors and prosperity will one day cause great changes in the world. He continues further down. The American ought therefore to love his country much better than that wherein either he or his forefathers were born. Again, he's saying, leave England behind, leave Europe behind, whatever country you came from, that America is your new homeland. Here the rewards of his industry follow with equal steps the progress of his honor. And then he talks about religion. Religion demands but little of him. The American is a new man who acts upon new principles. This is an American. And he talks about, the opportunity, the chances for people to come, be their own people, live their lives how they want to without other people interfering or looking down on them for their labors. And then he goes on with the rest of the letter. He talks about some of the different kinds of Americans. You can see on 313, he talks about those who live on the coast, those who live inland, and then he starts talking about those who live on the frontier. However, pay attention to how he describes these individuals. It's not exactly flattering, but he says you need to see this. These are the true Americans. And on the top of page 314, he who would wish to see America in its proper light and have a true idea of its feeble beginnings and barbarous rudiments must visit our extended line of frontiers, where the last settlers dwell, and where he may see the first laborers of settlement. There, remote from the power of example and check of shame, many families exhibit the most hideous parts of our society. So he seems insulting at first, that these are very basic people, if you will, that they're rude, that they're not cultivated. However, he celebrates them because they are so important. Why? It's these men and women who go forth and forage and start to settle the country and make it open for more individuals. Interestingly enough, who does he never mention in this letter? He never mentions the Native Americans, the indigenous people who were already here. He just kind of makes it seem like the Europeans came over, started settling it, and America itself was created. And then he also finishes talking about religious freedom and indifference that is available in the United States. And he ends the letter by talking, the paragraph I first read to you, almost out of that car salesman, that come on down, and here everything is for you. Everything is waiting. So with this idea of America, how do you describe an American and what it means to be an American? How do you think St. John felt about America at the time? He obviously had a great love for it, saw it as a land of opportunity. But now, let's switch to the next letter. This is letter 9. With this, his view of America has drastically changed. How and why? What is one of the great things that has changed it? Well, slavery. Slavery has changed it for him. And so now when he talks about the Americans, it's not very complimentary. He's talking about great commercial businesses. When he talks about the individuals, right, and he's talking about slavery here on 320. Their ears by habit are become deaf. Their hearts are hardened. They neither see, hear, nor feel the woes of their poor slaves, from whose painful labors all their wealth proceeds. And then he goes on about the same people he was celebrating. He's now seen them that they have changed, that they are now slave owners. The chosen race eat, drink, and live happy, while the unfortunate one grubs up the ground, raises indigo, or husks the rice, exposed to a sun full as scorching as their native one, without the support of good food, without the cordials of any cheering liquor. This great contrast has often afforded me subjects of the most affecting mediation. On the one side, behold, a people enjoying all that life affords, most bewitching and pleasurable, without labor, without fatigue, hardly subjected to the trouble of wishing. With gold dug from Peruvian mountains, they order vessels to the coast of Guinea. By virtue of that gold, wars, murders, and devastations are committed in some harmless, peaceable African neighborhood where dwelt innocent people who even knew not but that all men were black. And so for this, he's condemning the people, right? He's actually condemning most Americans for turning a blind eye to this, as he calls it, this plight that is going on, to slavery. And he talks about the slaves again. And for whom must they work? For persons they know not, and who have no other power over them than that of violence. No other right than what this accursed metal has given them. Strange order of things. O nature, where art thou? And then he goes on and he tells this story about a clergyman. And a clergyman was in Georgetown, and he was feeling the same way that St. John felt. And he was trying to talk to the slave owners about how they run their farms and then plantations. And what was the slave owner's response to him? They said, "Sir," said one of his hearers, "we pay you a genteel salary to read us the prayers of the liturgy and to explain to us such parts of the gospel as the rule of the church directs. But we do not want you to teach us what we are to do with our blacks." So the townspeople aren't interested in hearing what the preacher says. They say, "Look, you're here to teach us about what it says in the Bible. Stick to that." And he continues, "Slavery cannot be so repugnant to human nature as we at first imagine, because it has been practiced in all ages and all nations." And so the slave owners are again trying to justify what they're doing because it's something that has been going on for centuries. And then we come, and he concludes the letter with another story. And he's talking about how he was walking through the woods one day, and he came upon a slave in a cage. And this slave in a cage is a very horrific scene, that he's in a cage and he is suspended from the limbs of a tree. And he says all the birds were around him, eating him, picking at his skin, eating his eyes. And St. John fired his gun to scare the birds away. And then on the bottom of page 322, he describes this scene. "I perceived a Negro suspended in the cage and left there to expire. I shudder when I recollect that the birds had already picked out his eyes. His cheekbones were bare, his arms had been attacked in several places, and his body seemed covered with a multitude of wounds. From the edges of the hollow sockets and from the lacerations with which he was disfigured, the blood slowly dropped and tinged the ground beneath. No sooner were the birds flown than swarms of insects covered the whole body of this unfortunate wretch, eager to feed on his mangled flesh and drink his blood. I found myself suddenly arrested by the power of affright and terror. My nerves were convulsed. I trembled. I stood motionless, involuntarily contemplating the fate of this Negro in all its dismal latitude." So this scene is extremely horrific and extremely graphic. And he does this on purpose because he wants the reader to understand some of the atrocities that are now taking place in the United States. But what does he do? He talks to the slave in the cage, and he even says humanity herself would have recoiled back with horror. And what does the slave ask him for? He asks him for a drink. And what happens? He gives him the drink of water, but then he leaves them. Was this actually a kindness to him? Or was it a disservice? Because what has he done by giving him the water? He's probably prolonged his life and has prolonged his suffering. Why doesn't he shoot the slave, right? He talks about that. Well, he doesn't have another ball, meaning another bullet, so he can't do this. And so he's horrified by the slave hanging there, yet the letter ends, he leaves. He doesn't do anything, he leaves him up there. So think about this. What do you think St. John should have done? Should he have freed the slave, somebody else's property? Or should he have ignored him? Should he offered him the water or not? And then think about the differences in these two letters. How has St. John's view of America changed from letter 3 to letter 9? Has it changed, and why? And these are some of the topics I want you to think about as you are writing or thinking about this piece. All right, now we're going to shift topics to the second part of our lecture. And here what I want to do is I want to give you a little bit of background information on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court was established by Article 3 of the United States Constitution, which was ratified September 17, 1787. Our Constitution is the oldest and shortest written constitution of any government in the world. And the genius of the Constitution is that it was definitive in some respects, but also sufficiently vague in others. Why? So it could be applied to an unimaginable changing circumstances. think back the founding fathers in the 1780s, think about the technological advancements, right? Things that are being looked at today, such as who has control of the internet, who has the right to say what goes on the internet. That's something they could have not even imagined at that time period. And so the Constitution is set up so it can adapt to the changing world. On September 24th, 1789, Congress established the first Supreme Court. Remember, it was created by Article 3 of Constitution, but it was sat by Congress. February 2nd of 1790, the Supreme Court convened for the first time. However, they had no docket and they made no decisions. Interestingly enough, when the nation's capital moved to Washington, D.C. in 1800, the Supreme Court did not even have a courtroom. Congress gave it a small committee room in the basement of the Capitol building, and it actually remained there until the Civil War. Now, Supreme Court justices throughout history, there's been different numbers. Now we have 9. 9 justices sit on the court, and one of those is a Chief Justice. The Chief Justice is appointed by the President. Supreme Court justices are also appointed for life. And the reason behind this is so they don't have to worry about campaigning or keeping their seats. Why? Because they're supposed to be unbiased and impartial. They're not supposed to follow party lines. And so they don't have to worry about caving to political pressure to keep their seats. Supreme Court justices can be impeached. However, only one has ever been impeached, and the charges actually never made it out of the Senate. This was Samuel Chase. Interestingly enough, Supreme Court justices can resign, or they will be replaced if they die. Anthony Scalia just recently died within the past year or so, and that is the vacant seat we have. Interesting fact for you, William H. Taft was the only president to also serve on the Supreme Court, and he was the Chief Justice. He was president from 1909 to 1913, and he sat on the Supreme Court from 1921 to 1930. So now we'll talk about the role of the court. The court, interestingly enough, its job is to interpret statutes in the Constitution. And I have a couple terms I want you to know here, concurring and dissenting. When we have an opinion or a holding of the court, we have decisions that are put out. Usually the Chief Justice, if he is in the majority, writes the decision, or he appoints somebody else to write it. If the Chief Justice is in the minority opinion, the senior-most member of the majority then writes the opinion. However, you're going to see the justices also like to have their own words put out there. So when you have a concurring opinion, that means the justice agrees with the majority ruling, however, either has something additional to say or agrees on different terms. So that's a concurring opinion. Or we have a dissenting opinion, meaning the justice is on basically the losing side of the decision, yet still wants to have their voice heard. So again, the role of the court here, what they do is they interpret the statutes, they interpret the law, and they also interpret the Constitution. And they do this through what's called judicial review, meaning the court has the authority to decide that any act of government official and any law passed by a government body, if the Supreme Court deems that it violates the Constitution, it is invalid and has no effect. Remember, now this is any act of law or any act of a government official, right? If they say that's unconstitutional, for example, travel bans are something that is being looked at, right? If they deem it's unconstitutional, this was done by the executive order of the president, the court can say if it's unconstitutional, it is null and void. It has no effect. The Supreme Court can ensure that it is the Constitution that defines the extent to which our property and liberty can be compromised by our government, truly making this a government of laws and not of men. There is no appeal from a Supreme Court decision. It speaks last. To change a Supreme Court decision, either a case has to make its way back up through the courts and they can change their own opinion, which we'll see in our next section when we look at African American culture. We'll see the court, actually the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, is overruled or overturned by the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. Or to change a Supreme Court decision, you need a constitutional amendment passed. So how does the court work? Well, the court, again, 9 justices, 1 Chief Justice, and 8 Associate Justices. They are nominated by the President and they are confirmed by the Senate. Very rarely do cases go directly to the Supreme Court. An example of that would be maybe states are arguing over boundary line disputes. Otherwise, what happens is a case actually has to work its way up through the court system. And, interestingly enough, the Supreme Court gets to decide what cases it hears. So what happened is if you have a decision of a lower state or federal court, the litigant can file a petition with the Supreme Court seeking what's called a writ of certiorari. And I have that term for you on this slide here. Basically, what happens is the court decides if it wants to hear certain cases or not. The justices meet to discuss the petitions, and this is in a secure conference room. And it takes 4 justices to grant cert, meaning, yes, they think they should hear the case. If cert is not granted, the ruling of the lower court remains. Now, what happens if a case is granted cert? It goes before the Supreme Court. Usually very, very detailed briefs have already been sent to the justices and before hearings ever occur. So the Supreme Court justices do massive amounts of research and reading on the cases. Supreme Court hearings are open to the public, and each side presents oral arguments that are often, this is very different from the courtroom scenes we think of them. The justices often interrupt, they ask questions, and they can even challenge ideas on during the trials. After we have the hearing, a conference is held, and the justices discuss and vote on the decision. Again, if the Chief Justice is in the majority, he writes the majority opinion or assigns someone else in the majority to write it. If not, then it goes to the senior-most justice within the majority. Again, all justices can write concurring or dissenting opinions. These are then given to all the justices. They read each other's opinions and the debate continues. Basically, the justices decide if they will side with the majority opinion. When a case is decided, the majority opinion is released, but concurring and dissenting opinions are also all made available as part of the decision. Therefore, Supreme Court cases, if you read or take constitutional law, if you have to read Supreme Court cases, they are extremely long because almost always all the justices have something to say. So how does the Supreme Court then enforce its decisions? Interestingly enough, it can't. It depends on the other branches of the government to carry out its decision. For example, in Brown versus the Board of Education, which called for the desegregation of schools, you had states that were refusing to do this. So how was it enforced? The president calls out the National Guard. Okay? And again, your text talks about this on page 12. This is from the People's History of the Supreme Court. This could lead to very scary outcomes because what happens if the Supreme Court makes a decision, yet the president, whose job it is to execute the laws of the land, refuses to follow them, right? This relies on an ingrained constitutional traditions. Respect for the highest court's interpretation of the Constitution is, after all, at the root of what defines a government of laws and not of men. If the good faith of those who ever make up the Supreme Court ever comes into serious question, the moral authority of the court, which is really the only authority the court ultimately has, will evaporate with disastrous results. And this is from page 12 of the People's History of the Supreme Court. Peter Irons warns us about what happens if the other branches of government do not respect the authority of the court. So why study the Supreme Court? Well, this is also taken from your textbook. The intention is to enable the reader to appreciate the mammoth difficulty and consequences of the issues the Supreme Court has had to wrestle with, and to allow the reader to reach an informed judgment on whether the Supreme Court has earned its moral authority. These decisions help define who we are and where we are going. They illustrate the tensions between individual liberty and the interests of society, the challenge of balancing majority rule with short term while preserving fundamental rights in the long term. Like it or not, each of us and our children who come after us will be affected, even transformed by what these decisions say. And so that's why I use the Supreme Court as a basis for our study in culture. Why? Because historically, it helps us see what was valued or what was the culture's opinion at the time. And it can also help us see how this has changed and evolved. And it's also very prevalent and very relevant to our world today. We live in a very, high tension political world, and it's important to see and understand why the Supreme Court is still important and why and how it can affect everybody's life. So then I'm going to end this lecture with the reading I had you do from Chapter 9 to say what the law is. This is where I had you read this to understand how the court actually got its power, because its strongest weapon is judicial review. Again, the ability to say any act of any government official or any law, if it's constitution, it's null and void. And what becomes so interesting about this is it actually gave itself this power. And it did it with the Marbury versus Madison Supreme Court case of 1803. So what we have here is we are looking at the end of the 1700s. There is a fierce political battle between the Federalists. Think of John Adams as the leader of this side. They support the British. And the Republicans, whose leader is Thomas Jefferson, and they support the French side. Well, what ends up happening? Most of us know that Adams and Jefferson, right, were very, very close friends. However, their political lives take a drastic change. They both run for president, and Adams wins. Now, at this time, though, what happens is the person who got the most votes is president. The person who got the second highest number of votes is vice president. So you have Adams and Jefferson who are definitely against each other. Adams is president, Jefferson is vice president. What happens is that we have months after the November elections, the new president takes office in March. Now it's in January. The reason why it was in March is you have to think about this. The road conditions and weather conditions made travel difficult, and so that's why we waited till March for a new president. So what happens is we have in Congress, we have the president is Adams, Jefferson's the vice president. There's a new election, Jefferson wins, so Adams is the outgoing president. Well, what does he do? Is that Adams tries to entrench judges with his viewpoints he wants to entrench them into the government before Jefferson takes office. So what he does is he actually, at that time, the Supreme Court only had 5 members. He added a 6th justice. He then created 26 new posts in the federal court and in circuit courts. Of course, he appoints people who follow his ideas, not Jefferson's. He creates 26 new circuit judges and then 45 new justice of the peace positions. He claims this was to ease the burden of the circuit court. These are justices, judges who traveled around, but he did it fully because he wanted people who followed his own viewpoints to be on the courts when Jefferson came in. So what happens? He does all that. Adams then leaves. Jefferson took office on March 4th, 1801. James Madison became the Secretary of State. And what's interesting enough, who was Secretary of State under Adams? This was John Marshall, who is now the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Well, what happens was Marbury was actually given a commission to be a Justice of the Peace. under Adams. However, due to a clerical error, he did not receive his written commission, although it had been signed by Adams, confirmed by the Senate. Well, what happens? Jefferson is now president, and he is refusing to give Marbury the commission. Basically says, I'm president, I can do what I want. So what happens? Marbury sues. And he sues Madison, who's Jefferson's Secretary of State, who technically is the one who held the commission. That's why it's Marbury versus Madison. Well, what happens? The case actually sat for 2 years. The court met in February of 1803 for the first time in 14 months. And what happens of this is that the case was sent directly to the Supreme Court because of what was called the Judiciary Act of 1789. This was passed by Congress, and it allowed certain cases to kind of leapfrog and go straight to the Supreme Court. Well, what happens is Chief Justice Marshall felt that Marbury had been wrong, that he should have got his commission. However, Marshall also believed the Judiciary Act, which had been passed by Congress, is the only reason why it was heard. He says, look, the Judiciary Act is actually unconstitutional because Congress has overstepped its authority. It cannot enact this statute, which basically takes away some of the authority of the court. So, if the Supreme Court decides with Marbury, Jefferson, and Marshall knew this, that President Jefferson would likely ignore the decision of the Supreme Court, then making the Supreme Court look weaker and subservient to the president. However, if the Supreme Court decided with Jefferson, it would make it look as if the Supreme Court had caved in deference to the president, again making it appear weaker. So what is the court to do? They're kind of stuck in this situation. Well, Marshall kind of came up with this genius plan. And what happens is he issues the court's opinion on February 24th, 1803. And what he does in this decision was, first, Marshall declared that Marbury should have received his commission. And he actually chastises Jefferson because he does not give them this, right? So you have the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court basically reprimanding the president. So if you're Marbury, this seems good, right? All right, I'm going to get my commission. Well, no, because then what Marshall does is that he declared the Judiciary Act unconstitutional and that the Supreme Court does not have the power to actually hear Marbury's case. What this did, though, is it allowed the Supreme Court to show that it could invalidate a law that had been passed by Congress and signed by the president. But it shows the law is unconstitutional, so it is null and void. And that is how judicial review actually came about. The court basically gave itself this power. So what happens is it avoids direct conflict with the president, and they still get the power that they want. And so this case established the power the Supreme Court had in upholding and defending the Constitution. Marshall says, certainly, all those who have framed written constitutions contemplate them as forming the fundamental and paramount law of the nation, and consequently the theory of every such government must be that an act of legislature repugnant to the Constitution is void. Basically, Marshall is saying, look, Congress can't pass a law that goes against the Constitution. The Constitution is what forms our government. And if there's a law that is against the Constitution, it cannot be a law. And basically, he says, this is what the framers intended. It's so obvious that it can't even be questioned. And so with this, the Constitution is truly the supreme law of the land. Anything unconstitutional obviously is bad and therefore void. And it is the judicial branch of the government to say what the law is and that the Constitution is its guide. And so we hear any argument that courts must close their eyes on the Constitution and see only the law, again made by Congress, would subvert the very foundation of all written constitutions. So what happens with Marshall? It makes laws passed by Congress. If this was allowed, that would make them more powerful than the Constitution. And he says that was never the framers' intention. So why is this so important? Because if the Supreme Court didn't have that power, whatever ruling party, as long as it had a majority in Congress, basically could pass laws and do whatever they wanted. This decision is important because it keeps government officials in check. Because a single citizen armed with a creative lawyer can invoke the power of the judiciary to measure their laws and decisions against constitutional standards. And this case showed the power of the Supreme Court, and it made it an equal and powerful branch of the government. It proved the Supreme Court had the power to say what the law is and can bind Congress and the President to this decision. So that's a brief introduction into the Supreme Court also. Again, if you have any questions or concerns, please email me and let me know.